Okay, Parshas Yisro, the first Aliyah, but let's go back today to page 390. Page 390, the very end of Parshas Beshalach. Perek Yud Zayin Pasuk Ches. We know this Parsha, we know this story that I'm going to read to you right now, because we read it as the Kriyas HaTorah on Purim. It's the only, by the way, as an interesting thing, so you should know this for Jeopardy when you're the contestant and you're leading the world as the most knowledgeable person on Jeopardy, that when they ask you, is there a Kriyas HaTorah that has equal amount of psukim as every person that is going to be called upon that day, you'll answer yes. There's only one time that everybody gets the same amount of psukim, and that's on Purim morning. On Purim morning, each person gets 3 psukim, which is unusual because that's a violation of the Gemara in Megillah. The Gemara in Megillah says a minimum Kriyas HaTorah must be 10 psukim. So how do we give 9 psukim? Last time I checked, 3 times 3 is 9. So how do you give each person, and you have only 3 aliyot on Purim morning, so how do you give them each 3 and not have 10 psukim in the entire Kriyas HaTorah? So the Gemara says, this is an unusual Kriyas HaTorah because it's one theme. It's one topic, right? Anyhow, just remember that. And when they ask you that question, you'll be able to answer and you'll remember that you learned it here so that I can come and collect for the shul. It's meiser from you. Okay.
Could we also dispense for Israel, Kohen, Levi, Kohen?
No, that's a different point. But this for Purim morning, it's the only time you have 9 psukim, and it's the only time that everybody gets the same amount of psukim, and it's 3 psukim each. Let's take a look. And Amalek came and battled Bnei Yisrael in Refidim. Moshe el Yehoshua, and Moshe now appoints his trusted disciple. He says, choose your men and go fight Amalek. Because I tomorrow will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. And what will has Vayas Yehoshua Kasher Amar Lo Moshe Yilachem B'Amalek Moshe Aaron V'Chur Alu Rosh Hagiva. And Yehoshua did as Moshe said to him. He went to battle with Amalek, and Moshe, Aaron, and Hur ascended to the top of the hill. Vaya Kasher Yorim Moshe Yado V'Gavar Yisrael. When Moshe raised his hands, Bnei Yisrael were successful, were victorious. The Kasher Yoniach Yado V'Gavar Amalek. But if he would put down his hands, when he put down his hands, rested his hands, Amalek was successful. Videi Moshe Kvedim, and we were told Moshe's hands were heavy. You can imagine, just hold your hands like this for even 10 minutes and you're going to feel the pain. Vayikhu even vayasimu tachta vayashev oleha. So, but they needed to keep the hands up, we were just told. So what did they do? They took a stone and put it under him and he sat on it, right? Vayeshev alav Aaron v'Chur tamchu biyadav, and Aharon and Hur, who were on both sides of him, tamchu biyadav, they held up his hands, right? Each one took a different hand. And he remained with his hands in faithful prayer until sunset. And Yeshua weakened Amalek and his people with the sword's blade. He was successful. And Hashem said to Moshe, Hashem said to Moshe, write this as a remembrance in the book, and recited in the ears of Yoshua that I shall surely erase the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. Amalek will be destroyed, will be eradicated. Vayiven Moshe Mizbeach, and then Moshe did what? He built a Mizbeach, Vayikrosh Hashem Nisi, and he called it Hashem Nisi. Okay, Vayomer Kiyad Al Kes Kol Milchamol Hashem B'Amalek Midor Dor, and he said, for the hand is on the throne of Hashem. Hashem maintains a war against Amalek from generation to generation. That is the story right before we begin Yisro. You're going to see why I started with this story in a few minutes. Now, to our parsha. Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Aleph. Vayishma Yitro Chohem Midian Chotem Moshe Kol Asher Asa Elokim LeMoshe LYisrael Amo Ki Yotzi Hashem Et Yisrael MiMitzrayim. Now there was a man named Yitro, He was the minister of Midian, or as Rav Soloveitchik likes to say, he was the archbishop of Midian, right? The most important clergyman in Midian. He's the father, but he's also the father-in-law of Moshe. And what happened? By Yishma Yitro, Yisrael heard all that Hashem had done on behalf of Bnei Yisrael. So that Hashem had taken Yisrael out of Egypt. So now what does he do? He's quite impressed. Now Yisrael, the father-in-law of Moshe, took Sipporah, the wife of Moshe, after she had been sent away. Remember, they all had descended. Moshe with his two sons, with his wife, had descended to Mitzrayim on his shlichut to take us out of Egypt. But Aharon, when he met them coming down, right, said, hey, what are you bringing them for? Get them out of here. And they went back to Yitro. Now there's a reunification of a family. The Shnei Banel, and he also brought the two sons. Shnei Banel, Asher Shema Echad Gershom, Ki Amar Gerayisi Beres Nachriya, Pasuk Gimel, and her two sons came with her, right? Of whom the first one was called Gershon. Why was he called Gershon? For he said, I was a sojourner, I was a ger, I was a sojourner in a strange land. V'shemo echad Eliezer, and the name of the other was called Eliezer. For the God of my father came to my aid, he saved me, and he saved me from the sword of Paro. So he unites the whole family, right? Continues on. Now Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe, came to Moshe with his sons and wife to the wilderness where he was encamped by the mountain of God. So now the unification takes place. He said to Moshe, I, your father-in-law, Yisro, have come to you with your wife and her two sons with her. Seems a lot of repetition, but that's not going to bother Rabbi Soloveitchik because he's not reading, as we know in his commentary, he's not reading it like Rashi would or like a regular typical commentator, but we'll come to that in 2 seconds. Moshe went out to meet his father-in-law and he prostrated himself and kissed him. Each inquired about the other's well-being and they came to the tent. So there's the welcome. Everybody kisses each other. Everybody's happy. They come to the tent. And now, while they're being reunited, Moshe repeats. He says he has a lot to tell his father-in-law. He's the one that is speaking, right? Because he has the news. My father, Zichrono Livracha, when we would talk, he'd say, "You have the news. Tell me what's going on." You wanted to hear from me. Actually, Moshe had the news. Moshe had much more news than Yitro did. So Moshe is telling his father everything that Hashem had done to Paro and to Egypt for Israel's sake. All that travail that had befallen them on the way that Hashem had rescued them. Hashem had done quite a bit of things of miracles on behalf of Klal Yisrael. Yitro, and he translates Vayichad Yisro. So what does Vayichad mean here? He translates it as he rejoiced over all the good that Hashem had done for Bnei Yisrael, right? That he had rescued it from the hand of Egypt. If you take a look, I believe the famous Vayichad Yisro. It says, he says two things, Rashi, Vayismach Yitro, Zep Shuto. You see this in Rashi? He says Vayichad, this unusual word Vayichad. So it's Vayismach, like the commentator, like translation here does. And he celebrated, he rejoiced, right? But then he says, very famous comment based on Chazal, Naseh Bisaro Chidudin Chidudin. He broke out in hives. Vayichad Yisro, anxiety. He's listening to this. So he broke out in hives, right? That's what Vayichad, Chidudin, Miyetz al Ibud Mitzrayim. Just listening to all that had happened and how Mitzrayim was overwhelmed by everything that Hashem did to Mitzrayim, how this slave nation of Bnei Yisrael was able to overcome and to defeat Mitzrayim was unbelievable. So he became anxious, but Hayichad is the other answer to that word, the other translation for that word. Okay, Pasuk Yud. Vayomer Yitro, Baruch Hashem asher yitzil atrem miyam mitzrayim miyad paro, asher yitzil ta'am mitachad yam mitzrayim. Now we hear Yisro's response. And Yisro said, Baruch Hashem, blessed is Hashem, who has rescued you from the hand of Egypt and from the hand of Paro, who has rescued the people from under the hand of Egypt. Pasuk Yud Aleph. Atol yodati. Now I know. Ki gadol Hashem mikol elokim, ki vadavar asher zadu alehem. Now I know that Hashem is greater than all the gods. For in the very matter in which the Egyptians had conspired against them, he defeated everybody, right? Vayikach Yitro chotem Moshe laos v'achim le'elokim, v'yavo Aaron v'chozik nei Yisrael la'chol lechem chotem Moshe lifnei elokim. The end of this aliyah, and Yitro, the father-in-law of Moshe, took an elevation offering. He brought a korban and a feast offering, and Aaron and all the elders of Bnei Yisrael came and ate bread with the father-in-law of Moshe before God. They had a seudah. Okay, that's the story that I wanted to share with you. What did I share with you? I shared with you two distinct stories. I shared with you first Milchemes Amalek, and then Yisro's approach to Yisro's arrival to Machane Yisrael. Why would I share with you? Does anybody have any idea why did I start with Amalek? And this is what intrigues Rav Soloveitchik, because remember, Rav Soloveitchik is not a Mefarish like Rashi. He's not looking at every pasuk and every nuance. That's not what he does. It's a gestalt overview. What would the Rav, reading these psukim, be interested in resolving? What do you think?
You asked him question?
Yeah, what do you think?
I asked, this is almost a mystery. Something is missing here.
What is missing here?
The war with Amalek.
No. What my question is, I want you to think like the Rav. You've heard, I read you the story right before Yitro, and then the first aliyah of Yitro. You're Rav Soloveitchik. You're sitting in Rav Soloveitchik's study. What do you think Rav Soloveitchik is concerned about? What is bothering him with this overall picture that I just gave you? Amalek, Yitro. What do you think what is his major question?
The connection between Yitro and Moshe.
No, that's not. I mean, it's Moshe and Yisro are related. They're the father-in-law, son-in-law. What is that going to be? There's something here that's striking. What? No. Where are the people? No. Bnei Yisrael here. They're joining the entire reunification.
I think maybe because by this point Yitro did not recognize his God.
No, he says that he certainly does. He says, Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. He's the first one. The Gemara is very critical of Klal Yisrael and praises Yisro. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But what is I want you to think like Rav Soloveitchik. What would bother you in a gestalt fashion of these two stories? You have the story of Amalek, and then you have the story of Yitro. Ladies, what's going on here? What's the major question? This is the introduction to what? Thank you. What's your problem, Rita? Reword your question. This is the introduction to Matan Torah. Now, take it one step further. And who are we talking about? And Amalek. Or let's start his chronologically. Amalek and Yitro. And tell me, who are they? Finish the word? Gentiles. They're Goyim. This is the introduction to Matan Torah. Two stories about Goyim. That's what you want to introduce. The most important moment in Jewish history is Matan Torah. Most important moment, hands down, right? It's the most transformative moment in Jewish history. You're introducing it with stories about Amalek and Yitro, two Gentiles. Why in the world would the Torah introduce Matan Torah with two distinct different stories? I mean, if you had to give me, and we'll talk about this in 2 seconds, had to give me literally opposite stories, it's Amalek on the one hand and Yitro on the other. Okay? But That's the Rav's problem. The Rav wants to understand why in the world would God introduce Matan Torah? Because these are the introduction to Matan Torah. Yisro is all about, Parshas Yisro is all about Matan Torah. It's Aseret HaDibros. We're receiving Matan Torah. Why would we have an introduction to Matan Torah based on two different stories of non-Jews, Yisro and Amalek, Amalek and Yisro? We haven't gotten an answer. Now let's take a look. Okay, so now the Rav starts. Ayishma Yisro, right? Ayishma Yisro, and Yisro heard. He therefore wonders why, as I pointed out, why in the world would these be the introduction? What is it about these two stories? What is it about the story of Milchemes Amalek on the one hand and Yisro coming and reuniting with, what happens here, by the way? In your own words, what happens with Yisro? Tell me what happens with Yisro.
Recognizing God. Recognizing God.
Can you give me the pasuk? Can you give me the pasuk? Which pasuk is the most pasuk? And there's a transformation of Yisro here. Yisro, one word. What, Elizabeth?
Yitro, it's called a
No.
I think
The pasuk Yud Aleph. Ato Yodati, Gadol Hashem Mikol Elokim V'Yavador Asher Zodu Aleim. He says, now I know that my religion is worthless. Paganism is worthless. I've been believing in something worthless. I know now that Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is the God of the world. And what does that mean? What happens in Pasuk Yud Aleph in one word? He converts. That is correct. Yisro converts to Judaism. Right there. Pasuk Yud Aleph. And then Pasuk Yud Beis. Vayikach Yisro Chosei Moshe Olos Vachim Le'Elokim. Right? And then they have a. Okay, we're going to talk about that. But Yisro converts. Right here in this parsha, Yisro converts. That is right. What's most fascinating is, so why do we have Amalek introducing Yisro and then Yisro introducing Matan Torah, these two stories? He says, because they're opposite reactions to the Jewish people and to Revelation. On the one hand, we have Amalek, who on the one hand becomes belligerent, combative, right? He fights against Bnei Yisrael. He hates Bnei Yisrael. He's going to eradicate Bnei Yisrael from the face of the earth. That's Amalek. On the other hand, you have Yisro, who's intrigued by the Jewish people, intrigued by the Jew. He comes in total peace to find out what Judaism is all about. He's heard Vayishma Yisro, right? Rashi even says Vayishma Yisro. What brings him to? What did he hear? So he heard Yitzias Mitzrayim. He heard, it matters. Chazal give three different possibilities, but whatever he's heard about Yud, by this time, either there's a debate in the Meforshim. Does the beginning of Yisro introduce Matan Torah chronologically? Really? Did it really introduce, or did he come after Matan Torah? That's not my interest. From simple pshat, it's simple pshat. The Torah, the way it's written, is it seems to be an introduction. He comes before Matan Torah. He converts. So you have Amalek, who's also intrigued by the Jewish people, but his reaction is, we got to wipe them out. We got to wipe them out. Yisro is intrigued. He comes in peace. He wants to know what Judaism is all about. Both of these approaches represent the range of response of the Gentile world to the Jew. Both were impressed by the Jew, but both reacted differently. Both were intrigued and impressed by the Jew. Both act differently. And so the Rav notes a fascinating comment that you don't think until you think in the Rav's terms. He says, if you think Chazal, what's Chazal's feeling about Yitro? What's Chazal's depiction of Yitro? It's fascinating. The Rav says, in no Chazal, you'll not find Chazal depicting Yisro as a tzaddik. He's not some saintly Gentile. We do have in Chazal, in the Talmud, we do have stories of saintly Gentiles. We certainly do. We have in pages in the Gemara where we'll depict a saintly Gentile. But this is not a saintly Gentile. Yisro is never depicted as a saintly Gentile. You know how he's depicted? You know the picture of Yitro by Chazal? He's a mensch. He's a decent person. He's a good man. Saint? He's no saint. He's a good man. He comes out of an intrigue, he's fascinated. He obviously has an inside track because, and what that relationship keeps on being repeated and repeated and repeated in this first aliyah. What does it keep on saying? Chotein Moshe, Chotein Moshe, Chotein Moshe, Chotein Moshe. It's as if to tell you he has the inside track. But no matter if he does have an inside track, remember, he doesn't have a cell phone. He doesn't have the communication we have today. So he's heard. He might have a certain inside track, but you remember, distance is very important here. He most probably knows as much as the next guy. He has a more connected reason to be interested, and the Torah keeps on repeating that relationship, but he doesn't know more than the next guy. He's intrigued. So he comes. He wants to understand what makes the Jew tick. What is this nation? What it's curiosity that leads him to the camp of Israel, to Machane Yisrael. And when he investigates, he concludes, he comes to Pasuk Yud Aleph, which we pointed out, that his paganism is worthless, and he converts and embraces Judaism. In other words, Yisro becomes the paradigm, the model of the Gentile who is decent and whose positive reaction should be emulated by all other non-Jews as well. He becomes that model that represents that everybody should really, if you will, react just like Yisro does about the miracles from Yitzias Mitzrayim and of Matan Torah. Let me just close this door so we don't have. Amalek, however, and that's why I started with Amalek. Amalek is also intrigued. He's fascinated by Bnei Yisrael, but his response is just the opposite. He comes to a conclusion. He scratches his head and he says, Bnei Yisrael defeated the greatest and the strongest empire of the ancient world of its time. It defeated and destroyed the greatest leader. His name is Pharaoh. And they came along, they defeated the greatest power, they defeated the greatest king, and they're now promoting a new and different law to replace all other laws in the world. You know what our response to this is? We are afraid of new, and we got to exterminate it. Even though the Jews we were ever a threat to Amalek, not at all. What was our fear? They created a fear in their own heads. It's the Hitler of his time. We know better than anyone else what this story of Amalek is all about. And that's exactly what Amalek's reaction is. He's fearful of the person who's different. And who's the most different person in the world? It's the Jew. Am levadad yishkon. It's the Jew. The Jew is different. So what is fascinating to note, so we have, right, so far, what is the Torah doing? The Torah is introducing Matan Torah with two distinct models of Gentile reaction to the Jew. You have the decent Yisro, who's going to convert because he's impressed and he realizes, now I know the truth is with the Jews. And you have Amalek who says, whoa. They're so powerful, we got to wipe them out. What's so fascinating to note is that the Torah describes Revelation as a moment that entailed great fanfare. There is a word for this. It's called theophany. What's theophany? Theophany is an eruption of nature. We know it. We know it from the Torah's description, and we know it from your Musaf on Rosh Hashanah when you get to Shofros. When you get to Shofros and Musaf on Rosh Hashanah, you read these psukim. These psukim describe theophany. What's theophany? The eruption of how loud was the shofar at Revelation? It went from one end of the world to the other end of the world, and it didn't stop. And it's impossible to happen. Human beings can't blow a shofar that keeps on growing higher and higher and higher. It's just the opposite. Even Elspas, even Dr. Elspas, on his long Tekiah Gedola, he continues growing. It doesn't get stronger and stronger. It gets a little weaker and a little weaker. We don't have that capability. What happened by Shofros, the shofar of Revelation, the Torah tells us it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. It's an unbelievable announcement to the world. There was what else? There was eruption of nature. There was lightning. There was thunder. It was an eruption of nature. It was on loudspeakers. That's exactly what the shofar says. It's on loudspeakers. The shofar could be heard across the world. The purpose of this was that Hashem wanted the world to know something was happening. What was happening? The Jew was receiving the Torah. He wanted the world to know a new moral code, a new outlook on life, a new set of laws was being introduced to humanity. The world needed to know this. They needed to know the Jew was receiving a new moral code, a new outlook on life, a new approach to living, and it wasn't kept a secret. Matan Torah was not kept a secret. That's what you need to know about Matan Torah. What's most important is to realize that God did not demand of the other nations to adopt this way of life that the Jew was adopting at this juncture. But what he insisted is that they knew about it. They needed to know that the Jew was adopting a new law, a new moral code. Why is this essential? Why is it essential that the non-Jew had to know? And then you understand the answer to the question I asked. Why would you introduce Matan Torah with the story of Amalek and the story of Yitro? Because it's essential that the non-Jew knew that the Jew was receiving a new approach to life, a new moral code. Why is that essential? Again, I repeat, at this juncture, the non-Jew is not, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is making no demands on the non-Jew to adopt and to convert. Yisro is a single human being. Yisro is the only one we know that at this juncture that converts, right? We don't see a mass conversion of the world. That Hashem is not asking. Even the Midrashim, as we know, they go to each nation. They say, do you want the Torah? Do you want? We learned that as little kids, right? In other words, they knew, but there was no request to adopt the approach. Then, what's important about the word, the operative word is the then. At that moment, now they don't need to adopt, but knowing the Torah, knowing that the Jews had received a new moral code, eventually conversion of the entire world would happen. You're following me? Now at Matan Torah, Hashem is not demanding the non-Jews to convert. Knowing it is creating the groundwork for an eventual transformation of the world. In other words, the eschatological stage of life. When the Mashiach, when we call the Messianic era, the world will. But how do you get the world to go from point A to point B? You start planting seeds. The groundwork is being laid when? Right now, in the first aliyah at the end of Bishalach and the first aliyah of Yitro. What is it? It's teaching the world that there is a Torah, that there is a Yud Kei Vav Kei, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the real God, Melech HaKol Haaretz, that he's the real God. By making sure the world heard revelation, even though they didn't get the demand to adopt it, what are they learning? Very important. What are they learning? They're learning that revelation was not an experience of one individual. What are they learning? It's a cosmic event. It affects everybody. It sets into motion that eventually everyone would accept Hashem. Eventually. The groundwork is being created now for the future of the world to adopt HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The story of Yisro is therefore included to answer the question. The question is, will humanity eventually adopt Yud Kei Vav Kei as the God of the world? And the Torah answers in the affirmative. And it offers Yisro as a proof. Yisro becomes the first as the model and the paradigm to what eventually, operative word, eventually the world will do. And that will be, they will convert. The Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, the Rambam in Yad HaChazaka, and is what we call the Rambam, right? Not in Moreh Nevuchim. The Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, at the end of his halachic treatise, his halachic masterful work, he has Hilchos Melachim. That's the last sefer in the Yad HaChazaka. He deals with the Messianic world. That's where he does with in Hilchos Melachim. And there he says, what is the purpose of Christianity and Islam? He wants to know, what is the purpose? Why would God, in his great scheme of things, we're a small little people. We've never been a big people. The Torah says that. We're the smallest of people, right? Here you have Christianity and Islam. They're so massive and big. What is the purpose? You know what he says? He says exactly what I just told you. The Rav understands Yisro as playing. Why is Matan Torah introduced with Amalek and Yisro? Why? Because it demonstrates that eventually the world will convert to Judaism and realize HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Yud Kei Vav Kei, is the world is the king, is the Melech HaKol Haaretz. He says, what's Christianity and what's Islam? They believe in a monotheistic deity. So that creates the groundwork for an eventual transformation from Christianity and Islam to Judaism. It's the groundwork. The Rambam says the same thing. I'm not shocked. Rav is dependent upon the Rambam, right? The Rambam is thinking in the same fashion, okay? Okay, let's continue on. At the same time, the Torah lets us know the other part of the story. And that's what I started with this morning. It teaches us not everyone will convert. There will be those that will never convert. They also understand the Jew is unique, but the uniqueness of the Jew, they viciously hate and they desire to destroy it, right? The hating, anti-Semitism, if anybody tells you, we're going to wipe out anti-Semitism, you're Meshuggah, not in our lifetime, unless the Mashiach comes, right? It's not happening in our lifetime. It's not happening in this world the way we know it today. A Messianic age, yes. Why? Because, and that's why Amalek introduces as well the whole parsha of Yisro. Yisro represents the model of the non-Jew converting. Amalek represents the model of the non-Jew hating us and trying to eradicate us. That is the second lesson. Amalek is the paradigm of the approach of those who will never, ever convert and who want to eradicate us. The descendants of Amalek will continue to react in this fashion throughout history. We, the generation after Holocaust, can testify that that is correct. So you have the Rav's answer to the question. Why introduce Matan Torah with these two stories of Gentiles? To teach you, Yisro represents the eventual non-Jew converting. Amalek represents the eventual non-Jew not converting. Let's continue on. Also, that's the opening on understanding this whole story, this whole aliyah. So now let's continue. Vayetze Moshe likrat chodno, pasuk Zayin. And Moshe goes out to greet his father-in-law. What does he do? How does he act? Vayishtachu, vayishaklo. What does he do? What does Moshe do? He bows. This, just as an aside, this is interesting. The Rav halachically wonders. Remember, the Rav is a halachist. So he says, how could he? How could Moshe bow? Moshe was, according to the Gemara in Zvachim, Kuf Beis Amud Aleph, And the Rashi and Shvuas says Vav Amid Aleph Dibra Maslad Chen Tasu. Moshe was Vahi V'Shurin Melech. What's Vahi V'Shurin Melech? Who is it? Vahi V'Shurin Melech. He's Hasvei Rosh Hayom. Yachad Shiftei Yisrael. At the end of Parshas Zos HaBracha, who's the Vahi V'Shurin Melech? Who's the Melech? The Melech is Moshe. Moshe, we always think that Shaul was the first Melech of Klal Yisrael. That's a mistake. The first Melech of Klal Yisrael was Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe had the stature of a Melech. Moshe was also the first Kohen Gadol. Aaron was not. Moshe was only for 7 days. On the 8th day, it was transferred to, because Moshe taught Aharon the Kahuna Gedola. That means he was the Kohen Gadol. He was the first Kohen Gadol. It was taken from him. It was given to Moshe, however, was Melech. If Moshe was Melech, then we got a problem. What is the halachic problem? The halachic problem, this is just an aside, an interesting aside. What is the halachic problem? The halachic problem is that Moshe was told by Moshe bow. How can Moshe bow? A king is not allowed to be mochel his kavod. Why is a king not allowed to be mochel his kavod? For pragmatic reasons. You don't have a structure called malchus if the melech is not honored. The melech has to be honored. There has to be a respect for the malchus, or the malchus doesn't exist. That's by definition the way it works. So you compromise the honor of the king, you jeopardize the entire structure. That can't happen. So how did Moshe, who's melech, bow? Moshe, you can't. Anybody else can. A rebbe can give, a father can be meichel, but not a melech. A melech can't be melech. How did he bow? So Rav Soloveitchik answers by noting at this point, the truth is, yes, we call him melech, but was he appointed melech in a formal sense? No, Moshe was never appointed melech in a formal sense. And therefore, he did, Vahi V'Shurin Melech, maybe you can say then, yes, at the end of his life. But at this juncture, he hadn't a formal appointment. And therefore, it did not represent an official position. Therefore, he could be able to bow. It was just an aside, just an interesting aside from the Rav's halachic concerns. Okay, let's continue on. It was just something that I'm sharing with you that the Rav pointed out. So now go to Pasuk Yud. Vayomer Yisro. So what's Yisro's response to all of this? Yisro's listening by Yishma Yisro, and Moshe gives him all of the news and everything, right? We're told. And Moshe told him, right? In Pasuk Ches, Vayisaper Moshe l'chodno et kol asher asa Hashem l'Paro l'Mitzrayim alodot Yisrael. Moshe gives him, mesmerizes him with all of the stories. You know, Moshe sits down and he has a full Seder with him, right? He goes through Dam, Svardeya, Kinim, Arav, Dever, right? He tells him everything. He tells him about, if we're going chronologically in the text, he tells him all about Kriyas Yamsuf. He tells him Paro's gone, right? The whole army is gone. There's a whole new world. Why? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu did these miracles, right? So fine. So now what is Yisro's response? Vayomer Yisro, Baruch Hashem, asher hitzil eschem miyad Mitzrayim. And Yisro says, blessed is Hashem, who's rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians. Whoa, this is an important pasuk for Chazal. Baruch Hashem, this is Yisro's response. Yisro sings praise. As soon as he hears all about the miracles, right? This is the first time he's hearing about the miracles. What was his response, ladies? Song to Hashem, Baruch Hashem. He sings praise to Hashem. He praises God. This leads the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Sadi Dalid Omer Aleph, to make a remarkable and a brutally critical comment against Klal Yisrael. What happens here? It's an observation. The Gemara says that no one sang praise to Hashem about Yitzias Mitzrayim until Yisro. Yisro is the first to sing praise to Hashem about Yitzias Mitzrayim. Oz Yashir is Kriyas Yamsuf, not about the miracles in the Oz Yashir, if you will. Nobody sang about Dam Svadeya, Kinim, Aro, Dever, Shchin, Barot, Arbe, Choshe, Makas. Nobody's saying about that. We don't have any song on that. Do we have on the morning of, after Makas Bechoros, on the morning of Yitzias Mitzrayim, we have Kriyas Yamsuf. Yes, that's its own miracle. Kriyas Yamsuf we have on the seventh day, Shvi Shal Pesach. That's Kriyas Yamsuf. We have a beautiful minig in the shul. Somebody, Rabbi Mahler, wanted to know the minig. It was not in the minhagim. He says it's not in the. I print every Shabbos what you should do. So it wasn't there. I said, of course it's not there because it's not the minig of the shul. He wanted to know on Shabbos Shira, do we during Pesukei de Zimra say Oz Yashir pasuk by pasuk? The Chazan says Oz Yashir Moshe v'nei Yisrael Sashira Azos Ayamru Lemor, and then the Kal says Oz Yashir Moshe v'nei Yisrael Sashira Azos. He said we only do that once a year on Shvi Shal Pesach. On Shvi Shal Pesach and Pesukei de Zimra, the minig of the shul is to sing Oz Yashir just like I told you, because that's according to the Gemara one opinion on how the Shira was sung. There's a whole debate. There's a whole Gemara. There's three ways the Gemara says that Shira was sung. Was Shira, and who composed the Shira? It seems, did we sing a chorus? Did we sing, maybe it was just Ashir Hashem Ki Goyga. Maybe that's all we answered. Moshe would say, Ashir Hashem Ki Goyga. That was the chorus. Then he would say the next pasuk, Ashir Hashem Ki Goyga. Next pasuk, Ashir Hashem Ki Goyga. That's one opinion. There's another opinion in the Gemara that Moshe said the pasuk and we repeated it. Oz Yashim Moshe v'nei Yisrael Ashir Azos Layim Limor. Oz Yashim Moshe v'nei Yisrael Ashir Azos Layim Limor. Ashir Hashem Ki Goyga. Sus v'achol v'mavayam. Ashir Hashem Ki Goyga. Pasuk by pasuk. That's opinion number two. Opinion number three is we composed it at the same time as Moshe. Everybody. It wasn't Moshe. It was Moshe and Klal Yisrael who, in a nace, all composed. We all said it together. We all were inspired b'nevuah on how to say. So the Jew, the little Jew, and Moshe both were saying the same thing at the same time. That's the third opinion. Okay, but we'll come back to that Gemara in another time. But here, who sang about Yitzias Mitzrayim? No one. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Sari Dalet, Omer Aleph says, no one sang until Yisro taught us, Baruch Hashem Asher Yitzil Eschem. That's right. Take a look. Here it says, Vayomer Yisro Pasuk Yud, Baruch Hashem Asher Yitzil Eschem Miyad Mitzrayim, Umiyad Paro. Asher Yitzil Eschem Mitachas Yad Mitzrayim, Mitachas Yad. He's singing about all that happened in Mitzrayim, correct? The Gemara criticizes Bnei Israel for not engaging in such a shira. Gemara is very critical of us. We should have been singing way before Yam Suf. Why did Moshe wait until Yam Suf to sing? Many drush on it, but Rav Soloveitchik answers brilliantly. The Rav explains that shira, the experience of singing praise to Hashem, happens only as a subjective response to sensing you were the recipient of a miracle. If you subjectively feel you experienced a miracle, what's your response? Shira L'Hashem. Moshe himself was not impacted by Nisan. It had no impact on Moshe whatsoever. Why was Moshe not impacted by Nisan? He wasn't impacted by Dam, Tzvardei, Akinim. He had no impact upon him. Hashem told him this is what's going to happen. It happened. You know why? Because Moshe was a balmamin to his core that he knew we were leaving Mitzrayim. Hashem told Moshe, you're taking Bnei Yisrael out of Mitzrayim. I'm going to do the following to Paro and to Mitzrayim. I'm going to harden his heart so that they know that I am the omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent God. They're going to have to learn it. But the miracles were not impressive too. Of course Hashem does this thing. Hashem had a grand plan. Moshe believed it. Moshe had no doubt. We were not one iota of a doubt that we weren't leaving. It didn't bother him that Paro was hard, his heart was hard, and Paro became stubborn. And Paro, you go to Paro and you say, let us go. No, I'm not letting you go. And then the next Makkah comes. You might think to yourself, well, maybe it's not going to happen. Not Moshe. Moshe wasn't impressed one iota at all with any of the miracles. He had an absolute belief that Hashem was going to take us out. When Moshe finally sings at Yam Suf, Oz Yoshir, he isn't singing as a response to miracles. This wasn't what motivated Moshe. Rather, he's singing as a thanksgiving. You know what his thanksgiving is? Moshe is thanksgiving. If you pay close attention to the Shira, this is a brilliant insight. Moshe is singing a thanksgiving to Hashem for broadcasting the whole miracle to the whole world. That's what he's thanking Hashem for. Everybody is going to know about this miracle. And this was an enormous Kiddush Hashem. And that's what Oz Yashir from Moshe is. But Moshe, the Gemara says Moshe made a mistake. For Moshe, Oz Yashir, when it was sung, was perfect. Klal Yisrael wasn't at the level of Emunah, Pshuta, if you will. It's not only Emunah Pshuta, it's an Emunah that's phenomenal. Klal Yisrael wasn't on the same spiritual level as Moshe. They were profoundly impacted by the Nisim. Therefore, Moshe should have led them, according to the Gemara, on their level. Remember, when do you sing Shira? When you are impacted by a miracle. You believe you're the beneficiary of a miracle. What's your response? Your response is Shira. Moshe wasn't impacted by miracles. Klal Yisrael was. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Sadi, Dalet, Amud Aleph, where it says Yisro is the first one to teach us that, and it's a criticism of Klal Yisrael, it's a criticism of Moshe. He should have sensed that Klal Yisrael needed to sing. And Klal Yisrael should have sung, according to the Gemara, a Shira when? On the night of Makas Bechoros. It should have sung and the next morning, it should have sung as we're leaving. We should have stopped and we should have said, wow, we should have sung a song of Baruch Hashem. Baruch, isn't there now a song, Baruch Hashem, that's very popular, the kids are singing? That's what we should have sung. Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. I think it's, what's his name? Katz, who sings it, right? One second. So by delaying this expression of Shira for all these miracles, they were supplanted by Yisro. Yisro is the one who grabs the moment, and Yisro immediately sings the praise for the experience. We should note that Chazal in Brachos, Nun Dalid Amud Aleph, tells us that Yisro taught us not only to express thanksgiving immediately after experiencing a nes, which he does, right? After you experience the nes, right? As soon as Vayishma Yisro, and he tells us, he sings Baruch Hashem, he does one other thing. What does he do? The Gemara in Brachos tells us that Yisro teaches us a second lesson. Not only after you experience the nes, you should thank Hashem, and you should sing a song, but he taught us how to sing the praise. Yisro details the nes. Take a look in Pasuk Yud. Vayomer Yisro, Baruch Hashem. He could have stopped that. He goes on. Asher yitzil eschem miyad Mitzrayim. And then he goes on. Umiyad Paro. And he goes on. Asher yitzil eschem mitachas yad Mitzrayim. Right? He details, points out. In other words, when you sing the praise of the miracle, what do? Yisro details the miracle, and so should we. And that is why we say, Kol hamarbe b'tzapir b'tzias Mitzrayim hareza meshuba. What are we doing at Seder night? We're detailing the miracle because Yisro taught us that's what you got to do. That is why, notes the Rav, the Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah has a fascinating halacha. You know, Hilchos Chanukah and Hilchos Purim in the Rambam are 4 chapters. 2 chapters dedicated to Chanukah, 2 chapters dedicated to Purim. In Purim, the Rambam, 2 chapters, doesn't mention the miracle at all. He doesn't give us a history lesson. Chanukah, the Rambam starts off with a history lesson. Exactly the nes of the war, the nes of the Pach Hashemet. He gives us, that's how then he starts teaching us the halachos. where you light the candles, how many candles, etc., etc., etc. But he gives us an introduction to Hanukkah with a detailed history of Hanukkah. Why does he do that? Why does he do that nowhere else in the Rambam does he do this? He says, well, you don't have to do that for Mitzrayim. Nowhere in Hilchos Pesach does the Rambam, in Hilchos Yom Tov, does the Rambam tell us the history of Mitzrayim. Nowhere. Why? Because he doesn't have to, because we have the Torah. In Purim, we have the Megillah. In Hanukkah, we have nothing. Right? We don't have any biblical book that was canonized. We have outside the canon, the book of Maccabees. Okay, but that's later. But you don't have. So what does the Rambam have to do? You can't sing a song of praise to Hashem until you know the history, until you know the miracle occurred, until you understand that it happened to me. Oh, I'm a beneficiary? I sing. And you have to detail it. To replace this lacuna of not having any book, of not having any record of what happened at Hanukkah, what does the Rambam do? The Rambam introduces the laws. You can't get to the laws until you've done what? Until you've told me the miracle. And that's why the Rambam, according to the Rav, does in Hanukkah what he doesn't do anywhere else. He becomes a historian. The Rambam is not a historian. Rambam is a halachist. No, you can't appreciate the miracle until you know the history. So the Yisro teaches us another lesson. He teaches us, number one, you're the beneficiary of the miracle. What do you have to do? You have to sing a song. You have to thank Hashem. Number two, you have to detail the law. You have to detail the miracle as well. Finally, what you wanted to say something?
I just because you mentioned something about Shira when they sing it. If I'm not mistaken, there is a midrash which says that God actually was upset that here you are singing, but you're destroying.
Yes. That's 100%. 100%.
So it's like a contradiction.
No, we'll deal with that another time. Okay? But okay, let's finish up. Pasuk Yud Beis. Vayikach Yisrael, and you can remember this, and when you just remember this for your Seder. This is a beautiful thought that you can use at your Sedarim. Vayikach Yisrael Chosei Moshe Olo Zvachim Le'Elokim Vayavo Aaron V'Chozik Yisrael Lechol Lechan Im Chosei Moshe Ifnei Elokim. Now Yisrael does what? Yisrael, again, we're mentioning again his relationship to Moshe. He comes up with korbanos, right? He brings korbanos, and what do? Aaron and all of the elders of Bnei Yisrael come and sit down, and they have a seuda with Yisrael. What can the Torah be teaching us? By telling us that Moshe and Yisrael dined together. Moshe, Yisrael, Aaron, Ziknei Yisrael, they had a big seuda. Why are we being told? They partied. What we need to know about the after party. I mean, what's going on here, right? So the Rav suggests that it's a crucial moment because it reflects the Jewish approach to life. The Greeks, the Rav notes, only felt that one could encounter the divine through the intellect. God is the source of the intellect, the Greeks said, and therefore the only an intellectual experience can be a divine moment. That was the Greek approach. In other words, there was a clear distinction between the human experience outside the intellect and the intellect, yes, intellectual, that's divine. And all other bodily human experiences, that's not divine. You can't encounter God on that level. Judaism, however, taught that one could encounter God even in the most carnal activity called eating. We did this by doing what? By sanctifying the dining experience. Or in the Rav's words, Judaism developed a new institution. It's called the Seuda. That is why the Jew recites brachos before and after eating. When he engages a Torah discussion while he eats, he becomes a divine, it becomes a divine encounter. The Gemara in Brachos in 64a notes, whoever enjoys a meal in which a Talmud Chacham, a scholar, is involved, is as if he has enjoyed the radiance of the Shekhinah. What does that mean? That means the participation of the scholar elevates the biological activity called eating to a religious and divine experience. That's correct. So the Rav notes that that's why it was so important for the Torah to tell us. They had a party. They sat down and ate bread. That's right. That was a divine encounter. Judy, here is an example of the new moral code, the new way of life. Here, we're going to give it to the world. We're going to demonstrate, Yitro, you've come from the pagan world. The pagan world thinks that they can't have these kinds of divine encounters. You can have a divine encounter even in your everyday experience when you eat breakfast, lunch, and supper. If you make brachos before and brachos after, if you talk Torah and you transform just the biological experience of eating into a divine encounter, it is a divine encounter. That's right. The Greeks rejected that. The Jews are creating this new moral law, this new moral code. And here's the example. Example par excellence. As an aside, we can now understand why the Seudah takes such an important place in the Seder experience. Okay, so just to recap, and then I'll take your questions. To recap, what was the question that the Rav asked on this whole story? The Rav asked a very simple question. Why would you have Parshas Beshalach at the very end of Beshalach and the beginning of Yisro, which is an introduction to Matan Torah, about two Gentiles? Why would you introduce the most important Jewish moment in history with the story of two Gentiles? And what's the answer? Because they were the opposite reactions. The opposite reactions. You have Yisro, who is up, and Chazal depict him only as a mensch, as a decent human being who's intrigued. He comes, he converts. He becomes the paradigm. Amalek, he's also intrigued, but his reaction is, I'm never converting. Not only I'm never converting, I'm wiping this nation out because they're a threat to everything I stand for. Even though we threatened anything to them, but they realize the Jew has a greater mission in the world, and they're going to wipe it out. They're going to try to eradicate it. And what is the most important element of Matan Torah is theophany. Why? Why is that so important? It's so important because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted the world to know that this moral code was being introduced. Because eventually, though at that moment, the world wasn't in any way demanded. There was no demands on the world on the nations of the world to join Judaism, to convert. But it was the groundwork. It was planting the seed for an eventuality at the end of time, if you will, in the eschatological stage of our destiny, that what would happen? That the nations of the world will convert. And Yisro becomes the paradigm. Will it happen? Yes. You see, Yisro converted. When they realize, and that's what the Rambam says, that's the role of the other faiths. Why would there be so many people believing people in these? Because that's the groundwork. That's a belief in a monotheism. From that, he says, you can go much easier. If you don't believe in monotheism, why would you suddenly believe him? No, you go from monotheism, monotheistic belief of Christianity and Islam, to eventually realizing Yud Kei Vav Kei. That's how the Rav understands this first aliyah, which is the introduction to Matan Torah. The next aliyah is, of course, that's a whole different story of his advice to Moshe on how to run a judicial system. That we'll deal with Bezrat Hashem next year. Yes, Hannah.
I just want to ask this to be connected to what the Buddha made us in KG. He said that God will create a table so that was all from the beginning.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe 100%. I'm not just saying yes. Yeah. 100%. But you see that we saw quite a few lessons from just these few psukim. Okay. We'll continue next week. Yes, Ashir? Yes. Okay. Even though it's vacation. Okay.
You left me on now? How do I get out now?
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Was up, yet IASA will always try to get us down, no matter what.
Yes, yes,
That's just the way it is. from
That's the way it is.
history. That's it.
Yeah. that's the way it is.
Oh, thank you.
Never going to change, even
It's
back
not
for
gonna
10 minutes,
change.
right?
It's not gonna change.
Thank you.
The Gemara says,